Hello, this is the fifth part of Cruising in the 20th Century, a series of films which aims to show not only the liners and cruise ships of the time, but also shots taken of the ports and places visited during those cruises. In part 5 I've picked 4 cruises, all to the Mediterranean, from my collection of the late 1950s and 1960s. 2 are in P&O and Orient Line ships, Chusan and Oronsay, and the other 2 are Chandras cruises, starting in the Mediterranean in Regina and Fantasia. The film, as always, is largely amateur footage, shot by passengers and crew, with a tiny sprinkling of professional and commercial film. I hope you enjoy this film, and we're going to start with Chusan. Our first cruise is on the Chusan in 1956. Chusan was 24,200 tons and was built in 1950 by Vickers Armstrong for the P&O line. She, like other ships, became P&O Orient Line in 1960 and she was scrapped in 1973. On this cruise she sailed from Southampton, and it wasn't long before the passengers were enjoying sunshine and some of the deck games. Raising and lowering lifeboats was an essential task on any P&O or Orient Line ship, both while cruising and on line voyages. The clinker-built wooden boats nested in the larger steel boats. The first port of call on this cruise was Naples, and we're going to follow one of the excursions, in this case to the island of Capri. The passengers would be taken by ferry boat from Naples to the harbour in Capri. And after relaxing for a while with a drink or an ice cream near the port at the lower part of the island, they would make their way up to the top and to the town. Once back in Naples and back on the ship, there was time for lunch before making another excursion out to Mount Vesuvius in the afternoon. The way up to the top of Vesuvius seemed somewhat precarious to me. Once at the top, you could take a guide and walk further down. The steam rising up from the crater and the smell of sulphur was not particularly pleasant, but nevertheless it was quite an experience. And then it was time to come down again. The coach drove through the narrow streets back into the town of Naples. Dominating the scene by the quay is the Castel Novo. But as always, it was soon time to get back to the ship. Our next port of call was Cannes. The ship anchored out, and passengers were ferried ashore past a number of luxury yachts. This one could hardly be called a yacht. It was more like a small ship, but still, nonetheless, owned privately. How the other half live. I wish Daddy would buy me a yacht like that. From Cannes, there's an excursion to Monaco. The cameraman pans around this Mediterranean principality. The tourists visit Prince Rainier's palace, and we can watch the changing of the guard. The casino is one of the main attractions in Monaco. Now back in Cannes, we watch this lady mending the fishermen's nets. As we make our way back to the ship, one of the larger yachts passes us on its way out to sea. The captain takes a stroll round the decks and chats to some of the passengers. Our next port call is Ajaccio in Corsica. Once again, Chusan anchors out, and the passengers will go ashore by boat. Corsica was the birthplace of Napoleon Bonaparte, and the local Corsicans are rightly proud of the fact. After a day of wandering round the town, it's time to return to the ship. The return trip will be made in the ship's boats. Chusan was a fine-looking ship, a smaller sister to Himalaya. Our final port of call will be Gibraltar, and yes, once again we're anchored offshore. There's plenty to see in the town. And some of the tourists visit the Alameda Gardens. The South Port Gate and the Governor's residence. For the last time we're ferried back to Chusan. We now have 2 days at sea before arriving again in Southampton. Chusan is a splendid sight as she steams up Southampton water. We're now going to join the Chandler's ship Regina. She was built in 1939 and served the Chandler's line from 1964 to 79. 10,603 tons, was scrapped in 1985. The cruise commenced in Venice. We'll now have a quick look around the upper decks of the ship. Our first port of call is Corfu. The passengers are treated to some colourful Greek dancing. Our first visit is to the Archaeological Museum, which was built in 1962, with a collection of bronzes, statues, pediments, and many other exhibits. A kayak leaves the harbour packed with tourists. And we'll soon leave too by launch and go back to the ship. The captain awaits our return. A look around the promenade deck and a buffet lunch on deck on a day at sea before our arrival in Piraeus. Another of the company's ships, the Fantasia, is also berthed in Piraeus. We'll see her later. I think it's fair to say that most passengers would take the excursion to the Acropolis, but on this occasion the passengers have taken a different excursion, visiting other attractions around Athens. This, I believe, is the tomb of the unknown soldier. Going further out, they visited Cape Union and the Temple of Poseidon. And then it was time to make their way back to Piraeus and to the ship. We're berthed next to this Tipolus ferry. In port also a ship of the Mikhail Kalinin class, a Soviet ship. At sea again, and it's time for a little gentle exercise. If that doesn't grab you, then you can always place a bet on the horse racing. Or for a little retail therapy, there's always Regina's very own boutique. The next day we arrive in Rhodes. The passengers took an excursion to Lindos, the second largest town. And here you see the Acropolis of Lindos. See how narrow the streets are, looking down from the site of the Acropolis to the town below. They then returned to the ship. The next day they arrived in Beirut. It's not quite clear what all this is about. But maybe they'd come to see the film star being made up on the set. First, a tour around the town of Beirut. "54 kilometers outside Beirut is Baalbek, or Heliopolis, known as Sun City, where we find the ruins of the temple to Jupiter, built in 15 BC, although there had been a temple to Baal Hadid, much earlier, built by the Greeks. This is now a World Heritage Site. A traffic jam on the way back to the ship. Our next port of call is Haifa. I cannot be sure, but this looks very much like a World War II river-class frigate. In Haifa, the buses are lined up on the wharf for an excursion. We arrive in Nazareth and visit the Basilica of the Annunciation. The basilica has a magnificent 170-foot cupola which allows in the natural light. Here we are on the banks of the Jordan River. It was in this river that John the Baptist famously baptized Jesus Christ. The tour continued and they passed these ancient ruins of a temple on their way to Jerusalem. In 1966, Jerusalem was very much a divided city, as can be seen from these tank traps. We see the temple on the mount, seen from above, from the Garden of Gethsemane. Inside the walls of ancient Jerusalem. The temple on the mount. The busy city of Tel Aviv. The ruins of a Roman theatre. And then it's back to the ship after a tour of the Holy Lands. On board, passengers try out the clay pigeon shooting. After that, there's always the pool to cool down in. The next port will be Crete, dominated by Mount Etna. A lovely scene as fishermen unload their catch. The tourists visit the palace of Knossos. A stroll round Heraculaum. Back at sea before the next port, which is Dubrovnik. From the harbour you see the walled city. Inside the city walls. In the market we see this stallholder in her native Croatian dress. The narrow streets within the city walls, and here the entrance gates to the city. A kayak passes as we make our way back to the ship. The Regina leaves Dubrovnik and Croatian waters and makes her way to Venice. There will be a day at sea before docking at the end of the cruise. Regina will dock next to the ship San Marco. And we're going to join Fantasia, another ship of the Chandris line. Fantasia was built in 1935 and joined the Chandris fleet in 1964. She was 4,325 tons. She was destroyed by fire in 1976. On this cruise, the ship will visit Katakolon for Olympia, Crete, Rhodes, Patmos and Istanbul. Here passengers go ashore at Katakolon. a visit to the ancient sites of Olympia. Back at sea, it's time that the crew exercised on man overboard drill. You can see that we're back in Crete and at the Palace of Knossos once again. A different cameraman and some different pictures. Back in the centre of Heracleon, we pass the monastery and visit the market. Leaving Crete, our next port of call will be the island of Rhodes. Here we see the palace of the Knights of St. John. The gates to the palace of the Knights of St. John. The beautiful gardens around the palace. The island boasts a number of ancient ruins. Fantasia birthed in the harbour. Back at sea, we make our way to Patmos. We're going to visit the monastery of St. John the Divine, which was built in 1088 AD and is located at the top of the hill. Those on the excursion are going to use horses to get up the hill. From the top of the hill we look down on Fantasia. And we get a closer look as we make our way back to the ship by launch. Arrival in Istanbul. The officials come on board. There's always a lot of river traffic, particularly ferry traffic. The tourists on this occasion were lucky to catch a glimpse of the president. That's not him. Inside the church, Hagia Sophie. Inside the mosque of Bayezid. This is the column of Constantine. Downtown Istanbul. The Blue Mosque. And there we end the cruise on Fantasia. I'm going to join the Oronsay on a cruise starting in Southampton and visiting Malta, Istanbul, Venice, Palermo and Barcelona. We can watch as Oronsay leaves Southampton. Oronsay was built for the Orient Line in 1951 by Vickers Armstrong. She was 27,600 tons, and in 1960 became part of the P&O and Orient Line. Oronsay is about to enter Valletta Harbour in Malta. The ship will anchor in the harbour and passengers will be ferried ashore by tender. Typical Maltese inshore fishing boat. A street scene in Valletta in 1968. The tourists are now ashore and will go up into the main part of the town. A statue of the Knights of St. John. It's always very hot in the summer months in Valletta, and the passengers would be glad to get back to the ship. Some, as you see, are being ferried back by tender and others in the ship's boats. The next port of call is Istanbul. The Turkish flag flies from Oronsay's mast. We look up to the bridge from the arena, which as built would have been on a deck, but was now refigured as the stadium deck. As we enter Istanbul, we can see the two main mosques. Here, the Alik Ali Pasha Mosque, and here the Sultanahmet. The Soviet ship Bukovina and her sister, Chandris Karina Fiesta. There are also other cruise liners in harbour, none of which I've yet been able to identify. Here we visit the walls of Hisar. There were two forts, one on either side, guarding the entrance to Istanbul. Stopped for tea out of a samovar. And here we see a small Turkish kayak with a cargo of timber being unloaded. It seems surprising that even in 1968 people dressed up to go ashore. You see little of that nowadays. Our passengers are going to take a ferry on the Bosporus. These are very much working ferries, and you can see this as passengers board with their purchases from the town and some wares for sale further upstream. We get a good view of Oronsay as we pass by. We stop off here further away from Istanbul, and we see this typical Turkish market. You will note these rather ornate but all timber houses. We pass by the local fire station. And then we're back in Istanbul. But it's soon time to rejoin the ship, which will now sail out of Istanbul towards the next port, which will be Venice. As we sail out, we see the walls of Hishar from the sea. Arrival in Venice. The best way to get around Venice is by Vaporetta. We're now in St. Mark's Square. A view of one of the busy streets in Venice. A view of the Grand Canal. You'll see gondoliers. The Canale della Giudecca, and on the other side of the Venetian lagoon, the Lido. The next port of call is Palermo. The municipal gardens. A rather ornate fire escape. And here we see the very ornate Politeama Theatre. Our next port, and the last before we go home, is the port of Barcelona. as Ramblers. I'm not absolutely sure, but I believe this is a pillar for Cristoforo Columbus, who was funded on his trip to America by the Portuguese. Now we can take a ride on the cable car, which stretches along the coast by the side of the harbour. We get a good view of Oronsay from the cable car, and in fact we pass it on the other side. This monument is at the entrance to the Plaza España. And this, of course, is the famous cathedral, Sacra Familia, which is still not finished. Barcelona fought on the wrong side during the Spanish Civil War, and as a result they will not accept any money from the state. So the funds to build or finish building this cathedral must come from the people. And now we see Oronsay in the shadows as she makes her way back to Southampton. I hope that I have most things correctly identified in this film, if not correctly pronounced. The last shot is of Oronsay back in Southampton.